Okay, we're ready.
So, good afternoon, everybody from here in Singapore. Good morning if you're joining us from Europe as well. Welcome to this, our first public webinar of the year at the EU-ASEAN Business Council. We thought it being January, of course, we'd take a look ahead for the rest of 2021 with a webinar entitled ASEAN in 2021, Prospect and Challenges. I have a very distinguished panel with us today. We're going to cover a number of different areas. We have here in Singapore, Professor Tommy Koh. He's an ambassador at large for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, amongst many other things. He's also a professor of law at NUS and has a number of different chairmanships he has, including co-chair of the Asian Development Bank's Advisory Committee on Water and Sanitation as well, amongst his many hats. Joining us from Brunei, we have the Honourable Yanti Rahman. Yanti is currently the chair of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council for the year. A big task ahead, I think, for her. Brunei, as I'm sure she'll tell you, has lots of ambitions for the year. Yanti is also a practicing architect and was the first female president of the Institute of Surveyors, Engineers and Architects in Brunei, and is also a member of Brunei's Legislative Council. Here also in Singapore is Adam Schwartz. Adam is the founding partner and CEO of Asia Group Advisors, which is a strategy and investment advisory firm focused on Southeast Asia, and a long friend and also indeed a long member of the Business Council. And then finally, joining us from Hong Kong, we have Joseph Inca-Cotera, who's the chief economist for ASEAN for HSBC. Prior to this role, he was covering Pan-Asian economics for them, also based in Hong Kong, and has also been a distinguished and long-term international trade analyst focusing on China. So good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us. A quick bit of housekeeping for our audience. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask us any questions, or let me have questions to ask of the panel. I'd rather have your questions than the ones that I have in front of me. It'd be much more fun. What we will be doing, we'll be hearing from each of our panelists for 5 to 10 minutes on different parts of the outlook for the year. So Joseph will be covering the economic outlook for the region. Yanti will talk to us more about Brunei's plans for its chairmanship of ASEAN, and also the hopes that ASEAN Back has for the region for the year. Adam will cover off the geopolitical issues within ASEAN, of which there are plenty at the moment. And then Prof. Koh will talk also then about ASEAN's external relationships, how they might pan out for the year. And of course, we have an interesting year at the moment with a new president in the US, and maybe a change of attitude from there. So without further ado, I will hand over to Joseph first, so he can just give us his oversight of the year and tell us that everything's going to be hunky-dory.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction and for hosting this seminar. So I guess I'll start with the relatively obvious that 2020 was obviously a very bad year for the region, but it's actually that, Southeast Asia, ASEAN nations were hit disproportionately hard by COVID-19, especially by Asian standards, and even according to some other emerging market economies. Now, the reason is because of the severe lockdowns that were imposed in the second quarter of 2020. And these lockdowns for a lot of economies, particularly the ones with larger informal sectors, actually yield significant long-term challenges to growth. It's not just about short-term, because some of the labor market dislocations when you have a labor market means that actually it takes multiple years actually to kind of recover those losses. There's impacts on the banking sector, particularly in terms of the long run implications for non-performing loans, but also for investment. ASEAN economies have been increasingly investment driven in recent years. And when you have such a sharp contraction in investment, like in 2020, it reduces potential growth for the years to come. Lastly, given that countries had to dedicate significant fiscal resources to combating the healthcare emergency, it actually reduces some of the space for spending on areas such as infrastructure, for example, or education in years to come. So it presents some fiscal challenges as well for the region. Now, to make matters slightly worse, the recovery in 2021, particularly in the beginning of the year, is not looking particularly robust. We have fresh outbreaks or new waves in multiple parts of the region, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia and in Thailand to different degrees, but we're seeing new restrictions and a new hit to mobility already at the start of the year imposing new downside risks to growth. Of course, there is some positives globally with vaccines, although there's some uncertainty about the mutations. But even on the vaccine front, when we look at the pipeline in Southeast Asian nations, vaccination programs are starting already in multiple places. But in terms of reaching herd immunity, this is most likely a story of around the early 2022, middle 2022 for most countries. Really, the only country that can achieve herd immunity this year is probably Singapore. Next would be Malaysia, but even Malaysia, we're talking most likely early 2022 in the most kind of optimistic scenario, according to some of our analysis. Now, the good news is that once COVID is brought under control, either through containment measures or herd immunity, ASEAN does have a very tangible way to outperform the broader regional economy and emerging markets. And that's because the recipe for a recovery is in place. We have plans for public infrastructure investment that's largely already pre-financed in previous budgets or through other measures. We also have the fact that the region's been doing relatively well in attracting FDI. I'll get to this in a moment. So we are still confident on the medium, longer term story for ASEAN. It's just dealing with the short-term challenges. Now, in terms of these short-term challenges, we'll need more policy action in the short term. So for example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, we think the monetary policy still has a bit more room to act. Central banks can cut interest rates a little bit more at the margin, do a little bit more support for fiscal policy, albeit room is limited, and we'll be having to watch for inflation risks at the end of the year. Lastly, we think fiscal support will probably remain quite substantial in the coming months. There's a risk that, of course, if fiscal support was withdrawn too early, it would really hinder the recovery. But the best way, we think, to reaffirm the long-run strengths of ASEAN is for policymakers to signal that there still is very much a reform agenda in the region. And there have been some silver linings on this front. So in the second half of 2020, in Indonesia, a very important omnibus law reform for labor and investment was passed. It's a very good first start, but the ultimate quality of the reform will depend on the implementing regulations, for example, such as the repeal of the negative list, which opens up investment into more sectors in Indonesia. And that's going on right now. So, we'll have to really watch to see how the implementation goes. In the Philippines, we had a key part of the tax reform that was passed that will massively cut corporate taxes and streamline some of the tax incentives. We had a PPP reform in Vietnam that opens up infrastructure for private financing, which helps really increase the sustainability of infrastructure development in the country. But elsewhere, particularly in Malaysia and Thailand, we still need to see completion of ongoing reform programs from recent years, particularly for education, other areas of institutional reform. So, the reason why I talk about reform is that given limited pace of monetary or fiscal stimulus, if politicians show that they are going to kind of reduce the structural impediments to growth, that helps restore confidence in the region. Now, quickly, in terms of ASEAN's long-run growth story, the reason why we're still optimistic is that in 2020, despite the fact that global foreign direct investment flows fell by around 40%, in many parts of ASEAN, it was either steady or actually even grew somewhat. And that shows that ASEAN still is very competitive from a supply chain argument. Now, part of that is these ongoing shifts due to the US-China trade tensions, for example, diversifying supply chains within Asia. But it also reflects the fact that many countries have very competitive positions in the global semiconductor space. And as we know, in this era of work from home, increased digitization, server demand, there's booming demand for chips. And ASEAN is benefiting from this. And we see fresh investment flows, especially in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Vietnam. And this is really contributing to ASEAN being at the center node of the global semiconductor chain. And again, we're seeing fresh flows, which boosts this. We're also seeing new investment in the electric vehicle space in Indonesia, given its large nickel reserves, stainless steel, and other investment opportunities. RCEP further kind of accentuates these benefits because of the coordinated rules of origin regulations. It actually further boosts, and we think, ASEAN's role as a production base. So this is kind of leading to the reason why the manufacturing growth has been strong in many parts of ASEAN, and why we think that continues in the coming years. The last point I'll make is, and this is something I'll talk a little bit about because we're very fortunate to be joined by the representative from Brunei, but increased ASEAN integration really accentuates the benefits of ASEAN's FDI story and its export potential. And we know that as much as this has been an incredible area of growth for ASEAN, there's still non-tariff barriers, there's still areas of concerns that have not been finalized from previous rounds of negotiations. So if ASEAN as an entity is able to show the world that it's continuing to build on an effective economic integration, it will only further boost the region's attractiveness as a supply chain hub and as a production base. So this is, in short, some of the themes that we think are driving growth in the region despite the short-term challenges. And I look forward to any questions in specific industries and countries later in the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. You're surprisingly optimistic, more optimistic than I am, but we'll come back to that in a moment. We'll move to Yanti now, especially you just mentioned about Brunei's chairmanship, and ask Yanti to give us an overview of what Brunei's ambitions are and indeed the hopes of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council for the year and where she thinks we might end up come December. So Yanti, please.
Thanks, Chris. In fact, I just want to actually update everyone. Brunei have been blessed with, we've been having about 266 days without any COVID, any local cases. So that's something very optimistic. In fact, now, we can actually have an event maximum of 350 in an event. So we can now have more weddings in Brunei and more other activities. So we're actually quite blessed with that too. Now, we actually have revealed Brunei's chairmanship priority deliverables for 2021. In fact, under the priority economic deliverables under Brunei, there are 3 strategic trusts for the chairmanship that is basically focusing on 3 areas: recovery, digitalization, and also sustainability. And within that, there's basically 10 priority economic deliverables under these 3 trusts. So the trust, the first one that falls actually under recovery is the 4 deliverables, which actually covers the comprehensive assessment to streamline the non-tariff measures. Second one is to actually look into the recovery plan for ASEAN tourism, the post-COVID-19, launch of the negotiation for the possible ASEAN-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and also the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, which is AIFF. So under digitalization, there are 2 particular areas, which is to the work plan on the implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on Electronic Commerce, which is from 2021 to 2025, and also a regional action plan on the implementation of the norms, responsible states behavior in the cyberspace. With regards to sustainability, the final trust is looking at the ASEAN framework to support food, agriculture, and also forestry. Small producers, cooperatives, and MSMEs to improve the product quality to meet the standards and also ensure competitiveness. The second one is the ASEAN Joint Declaration on Energy Transition and also energy security. Third is framework for circular economy for the AAC, and the fourth one with regards to the imperatives for regional cooperation in minerals, key recommendations to respond in the opportunities and challenges for that. Now, what we can actually look into in terms of what EU has been supporting the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community by being one of the ASEAN's largest trading partners and also the biggest provider for the FDIs, in fact, into ASEAN. So we are very grateful for the great work. In fact, EU, ASEAN BUC has been extending to the ASEAN and pushing hard, especially on the ASEAN trade facilitation reforms through our JBC Trade Facilitation Working Group as chair. Now, we also recognize the invaluable contribution that it is with Chris has made in putting together the pathway to 2.5. So we are indeed very grateful, and we have been highlighting this to the leaders as well. So what we're trying to do this year under the Brunei chairmanship, Brunei, our theme is actually recover stronger together, sama sama. So what we're trying to do is the commitment to identify private sector champions who can really partner with us in supporting not just ASEAN Bank but also Brunei priority economic deliverables for this. So it is looking into the trade facilitation, e-commerce, and also MSMEs, which we are very much involved in it already. So I do hope that with EU-ABC can actually encourage its membership and network to help us fill in the gaps, because we do need to actually look through all this. I think the other thing that we wanted to look into is the continuous support from EU businesses is also the EU-ASEAN programs to facilitate trade and integration to speed up economic recovery, bringing business together where business leaders make key recommendations to further improve trade between the two regions, and also continuous and regular sharing experiences, of course, both success and challenges of how to make integration work. So these are some of the things that we really need to look into, and also create FTAs between other ASEAN countries as well, between EU and Singapore. Vietnam have entered these FTAs into force, in fact. So we hope that other things that we can actually look into is regular surveys conducted by EU-ABC on how EU businesses assess doing business in ASEAN. So we actually look into if we actually look at what are the top 2 or emerging trends in ASEAN businesses that we actually need to be mindful of, is really in terms of the medium term economic trends is of course the RCEP. Now, but we do need to actually make sure the sooner AMS ratifies the RCEP, the sooner the RCEP can really be tested. Now, we have to also be cautious that economic benefits don't end up to concentrate only in the to the +5, Japan, China, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The goal of being globally competitive as a result of FTAs at the end of the day will make ASEAN competitive and highly attractive to the rest of the global value chains. So this is where the private business sector can actually engage, and it's so important that we need to identify who should really be beneficiary of expanded markets and ease of doing business. I think in terms of the short term, the growth actually drive from the government itself, and what's important is with regards to vaccines. I mean, we look into the fast track of the acquisition of vaccines and improving the healthcare infrastructure. But with the current issues that we also face from EU with regards to the threat and also to the blockage of exports of vaccines, we do hope that this will not be a stumbling block in terms of recovery. So now the other one is to actually look into the ensuring supply chain resiliency, especially for essential goods services, and also building the base for strong and sustained digital transformation infrastructure. So these are few things that we actually look into in terms of the top 2 emerging trends for the ASEAN business, which we all need to be mindful of, Chris. Thank you.
Many thanks, Yanti, and thank you very much indeed for the kind words about the EU-ABC and myself. It's very welcome. Thank you. I'll turn now to Adam, if he can perhaps come and give us the geopolitical view within ASEAN. There's lots, of course, going on within the region, or going to be happening very soon, and I'm sure he has plenty to say on that. Adam.
Chris, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks again for putting this panel together. There's certainly a great deal to talk about. So we have sort of a top line message, kind of quite similar to the perspective Joseph laid out. Obviously, any conversation about the economics and the geoeconomics there's a major caveat which Joseph and Yanti have spoken about, which is of course COVID. And so there's obviously a lot of other factors in the mix here, but ultimately, to the extent to which the region deals effectively with COVID in terms of testing and delivering healthcare facilities to infected people, procuring and rolling out and distributing vaccines, is going to be the primary driver impact on sort of how and when we see the economic picture start to recover. And that, of course, is not just an ASEAN story either, just given ASEAN's dependence on tourism, on convention and business travel, on trade, obviously the recovery and the timing of the recovery of export markets. And in other words, it's a global story, as it is for everybody, but it's also true that how the globe deals with COVID is going to be also have a major impact on ASEAN. All right, so leaving aside that very important caveat for a sec, our view is very similar to what Joseph was just laying out, is that the intrinsics for the economic intrinsics are pretty solid for ASEAN. And let me go through a couple of reasons why we think that. So compared to other clusters or groups of emerging markets, ASEAN benefits from, like in the real estate market of being in a good neighborhood. So the two large economies of this region, China and Japan, are rebounding from COVID faster than the other advanced industrial economies. If you look at Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, on a whole bunch of metrics of per capita infections, per capita fatalities, the experience has been much. I mean, obviously it's been serious, and I don't want to minimize that, but it has been less serious than many countries in North America and Europe, and hence the foundation for economic recovery is stronger, and ASEAN will be a beneficiary of that. To date, anyway, the ASEAN and Southeast Asia generally has been a beneficiary, I would say, of the rising U.S.-China tensions. It's made for a bit of discomfort and anxiety for sure, but in terms of what's actually happening on the ground, the diversification of investment off of the eastern seaboard of China and a lot of global MNCs, taking or implementing their China Plus One strategy much more aggressively has actually played to the benefit of ASEAN. Vietnam has probably been the primary beneficiary to date, and that goes back a little earlier when companies were sort of investing in Vietnam pre-TPP, or now cptpp, as we call it. But you see around the region other countries beginning to compete more aggressively for that outbound investment out of Northeast Asia. Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines all have policies around industrial zones, investment incentives, deregulation reforms, et cetera. Joseph mentioned the omnibus law of job creation in Indonesia is a good example of that. So number three, and related to that second one, is while there are and will continue to be concerns about protectionism and nationalism, and given the economic dislocation and pain that's happened in a lot of countries at a policy level.
Can't hear you, Adam. Lost your voice.
Government spent a huge amount of, use a huge amount of fiscal space already, and will need to continue to spend more on COVID recovery, are very actively trying to seek external capital. And so we've seen a number of countries pass laws, or whether it's the current state of the constitutional reform discussion in the Philippines, or some of the efforts that Thailand's making on the digital economy space, or in a very broad-based way what Indonesia is trying to accomplish with the omnibus law and job creation, you're seeing quite a concerted effort around the region to attract capital rather than repel it. And given the fiscal strain all these countries are on, and it will get bigger, it will get worse before it gets better. We expect that mindset to stay that way. And finally, again, not to repeat the point that both Joe and Joseph and Yanti made, but this region has not sat still on the trade front and trade deals. RCEP got a lot of attention, obviously, at the ASEAN summit last fall, but there's been a step up in the EU-ASEAN strategic partnership. Vietnam has an EU-ASEAN FTA in place. Indonesia has finalized an Indonesian-Australia comprehensive economic partnership agreement and is working on something similar with the EU. So the region has been quite active in integrating within itself and within the broader Asian region and globally quite actively. And that, again, is a different story than we've seen in other parts of the world, and again creates a stronger foundation for ASEAN as the COVID risk recedes. Although we don't have a different view from Joseph in terms of that's a 2022 story as much as it is as a 2021 story. So the question was on sort of are politics going to kind of get in the way of that story, and our view is they could, but we don't actually see a lot of that so far. Unfortunately we had two large elections in Malaysia and Indonesia in 2019, and 2018 in Malaysia, 2019 in Thailand and Indonesia. So and late last year in Myanmar. So the Indonesian election is pretty clear. Jokowi has got a very, has consolidated his victory. He's got a very strong governing coalition. The country was able to have regional elections last year that got a high voter turnout and went pretty well. No real issues with that. Jokowi's got a pretty strong majority in the parliament. He was able to get through this very ambitious omnibus law, though as Joseph said, there'll be dozens and dozens of implementing regulations still to come, which obviously will be the proof of the pudding on that one. Thailand had elections, and those are sort of unraveling a bit. There is a student-led protest, a progressive movement that sort of was triggered after Kun Thanathorn and his Future Forward Party were delisted from politics, so to speak. So that holds the promise of, well, not holds, but promise is probably the wrong word there. It creates a risk of political instability, but from a business point of view, Thailand's politics have been in a fair bit of turmoil really for the last 20 years, and the business community has been able to deal with it and address it. Thailand has a very strong civil service. Just in our own business, we actually haven't seen this latest round of politics making much of a dent on kind of investors' perceptions of Thailand. There's still a lot of money going in. Thailand, of the major ASEAN economies, is the one hardest and worst hit by COVID. It's probably, well, I should say that we were just surprised by the news today on the Philippines that GDP shrank by 9+% last year. So that may even be higher than Thailand. So anyway, but just to stick with Thailand for one more sec, our view is that so far there's a degree of insulation between the policy making and the politics and ferment above that. And as long as that holds true, we don't necessarily see the politics being a distinguishing characteristic of what happens on the economic side of Thailand going forward. The Philippines is the one major country where we have elections to look forward to. Rodrigo Duterte's term ends in the middle of next year, 2022, in May. There hasn't been as much attention on it as there might otherwise have been, just because so much attention is being taken up both by COVID and also by the question of, will they change the Constitution? And that's gotten a lot of pushback. The Constitutional reform started with really a push to really more towards federalism and kind of giving the states more right, but it's been taken over by the concern or the issue of whether this will also have the impact of having Duterte be able to stay in power. There's now sort of more recently, the conversation on the Constitution is focused on how to change some of the economic provisions, again, for the purpose of opening up to more FDI and making it more, taking away some of the investment restrictions that are in the 1987 Constitution. So, there's, again, we're not overly concerned about that from a business point of view. In fact, the government is really aggressively trying to get increased investment going forward. So that very briefly, Myanmar was able to get even in the midst of COVID, very successful elections, over 70% voter turnout in November. Aung San Suu Kyi has consolidated her control. She got 3/4 of the seats in the parliament. Some of the military-linked parties are claiming electoral fraud. The Constitutional Court will rule on that tomorrow. Most observers think that case will get thrown out. So again, politically, at sort of at the high level in Myanmar, it seems pretty stable. So we don't, relative to that list of issues that I went through a bit earlier in terms of kind of the economic intrinsics going forward, we don't really see the politics are, they're there. They could get worse. Worth keeping an eye on for sure. But we don't at this point see the politics undermining that economic story. So let me pause there. I'm happy to sort of dig into any individual countries in a bit more detail in the Q&A.
Many thanks, Adam. That was a very quick cant around the region. And finally, we'll come to Professor Tommy Koh, who I hope will give us his insights into how ASEAN's external relationships might change this year and develop, particularly as we now have a new administration in Washington, and now the UK is completely outside of the EU as well, and indeed how China might continue to increase its influence in the region. So, Professor Koh, please.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to begin by sharing with the panel what I consider some of the good news of a bad year. So since this webinar is being organized by the EU-ASEAN Business Council, I want to begin by saying, one, that the conclusion of the upgrading of the ASEAN-EU relationship to a strategic relationship is good news. And I hope it's not just rhetorical and semantic. I hope both sides, the people in Europe and the people in ASEAN, will take a long-term strategic view of this relationship and not a transactional one. My sense is that ASEAN has underperformed in Brussels, and I think the EU has underperformed in ASEAN. The second good news of the last year was the conclusion of RCEP. I think in the midst of a crisis, to get 15 countries to agree to conclude this mega free trade agreement, I think was an achievement. My only regret is that India decided at the last moment to opt out. I think, given time, I hope my Indian friends will reflect on this and come to the conclusion that trade is strategy, and India cannot afford not to be part of this important geo-economic infrastructure. So my third point is that China is growing well, and China may be the only major economy that had positive growth last year. And the projections are China will continue to do even better in 2021. I think the Chinese economy is lifting the region. So I think that's the third good news. The fourth good news is that in spite of the pressures, ASEAN has not turned inward and has not become protectionist. The ASEAN economy remains outward looking, and it is integrating both among ourselves, the 10 of us, but also seeking to integrate with our dialogue partners. And the fifth good news is that ASEAN remains united. And this is really important in the face of intense competition for influence in this region between the United States and China. President Trump may be gone, but I think this dynamic will continue. President Biden's administration will be more stable, more rational, more predictable, but the US-China strategic competition will endure. And it is a great challenge for us in ASEAN to navigate this and to be neither allied to the one nor the other, to remain united, to remain independent, to remain neutral, and at the same time to be useful to both of them as well as to other great powers such as India, Japan, and the European Union. My final point is that 2021 will be a good year for ASEAN. The World Bank has projected that the ASEAN 10 collectively will grow by about 5.2%. And the three countries that will have the strongest growth will be Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. I think Singapore is projecting to grow around 3%. And as I think Joseph said, what is remarkable that even in a bad year, 2020, several of the ASEAN countries received an increased inflow of FDI. I was very surprised when the Economic Development Board in Singapore announced that in 2020, it managed to raise more commitments of FDI than we did in 2019. I thought this is quite remarkable. And I think Singapore are not alone. So it's a sign of confidence in ASEAN. It means that our economic fundamentals are sound, and that once the world recovers, the ASEAN economies will grow well. I think I'll conclude there, Chris, and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Koh. Well, I must say, the four of you are all incredibly positive about this year, so I should take some heart from that. I'm not sure I share your views, and perhaps we'll explore that a bit here and now in the Q&A. And I think all four of you spoke about reform to varying degrees, to whether it was domestic reform in Indonesia or the Philippines or elsewhere, or the need for regional reform through Brunei's priority economic deliverables, or as Professor Koh was talking about, the AEC is key. Let me just ask all three of you, I mean, how do you really see reform being delivered across the region? How do you see economic integration being driven forward? And do you see that as being more important than domestic reform in each of the countries? Perhaps I'll ask Yanti to start off on that one for me, as she's chairing ASEAN Back this year, and ASEAN Back, like ourselves, is always pushing on ASEAN integration.
Chris, like we always think like what Brunei chairmanship this year, and then we emphasize with regards to the theme of we care, we recover, and we prosper. The recovering part is what is happening now, and then we have to actually be hopeful to what's going to happen, and we have to prepare ourselves. So that's definitely for sure. And I think in the pipeline that we are doing, there's a lot of things that under ASEAN Back that actually has done. And the good thing with the interface with leaders, the leaders are also listening to the voices from the MSME. So that's something very positive. But I think along the years, when I'm actually joined the ASEAN Business Advisory Council as well, there's a lot of agenda that has not been able to push. I mean, basically, it's just in the pipeline. Sometimes how we wish like no agenda is better than having a lot of agenda as well. So I think for what we are trying to see now is pushing a lot of these issues in the pipeline and making sure that the implementation can actually happen. We for the chairmanship of Brunei, we're basically just hopeful that things can actually be pushed, and how I wish that we can actually move physically and really meet a lot of the things, because by having a lot of this video conferencing, sometimes it does limit us to really have more conversation, because after this, we don't really have a sideline, a meeting as well. So you see, so I think one thing that I really hope for is really having that discussion to have more available discussion. So there's a lot of things that we need to actually do in Brunei, and we do hope that this is not just the beginning, but it's a continuation of what we can actually do as overall being part of the recovery. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Yanti. But Joseph, can I ask you to pick up on the same question? And indeed, economic reform to help drive growth in the economy is going to be key, given the amount of money that governments have been spending on support and hopefully then on recovery as well. So regional reform, regional economic integration, is that a bigger driver, do you think, than doing it all domestically?
Yes, I mean, the easy answer is that you need both domestic reforms and regional reforms. But I think it's hard to say which is more important, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still on the local, on the domestic level. And I think that's where governments have to start. So for example, let me take the FDI angle, because the reason why we focus on this so much is that if you look at ASEAN's growth from the 1970s, or even Asia more broadly speaking, major productivity gains and growth actually comes through the manufacturing sector, attracting FDI, and then that you have that technological spillover to domestic firms, then that drives even more growth. And I think in the last few years, you saw very strong FDI inflows in Vietnam, of course. Malaysia has been very resilient. Singapore, all these countries saw very resilient inflows even in 2020. But the laggards in the region, you could say, have been Indonesia and the Philippines, where FDI has been generally below 2% of GDP, where exports as a share of GDP is generally below 20% compared to, say, 90 to 100% in Vietnam. And that's why we were comforted to see that, Philippines and Indonesia started to address these low-hanging fruit. So for example, in Philippines, there was so much uncertainty over corporate tax reform and the incentives that foreign businesses were getting because they were being changed in this law. You saw complete collapse in investment. So in the third quarter of 2020, FDI in the Philippines, I think, dropped something like 90%. Because of this uncertainty plus COVID. So finally having that certainty on the tax policy and hopefully moving forward with other areas of that should provide a bit more confidence. Similar in Indonesia, in recent years, you've seen some actually deindustrialization, you can say. The manufacturing sector in Indonesia, the share of GDP has actually shrunk despite a large young workforce, natural resources that can be brought into more downstream industries. So this omnibus law, which of course, is debatable in some areas. There's some people that would criticize some specific provisions, but generally speaking, it does massively liberalize and make it easier to invest in the country, reduces overlapping regulations on the local level and on the central level, and makes the labor code a bit more in line with, let's say, what you see across the region. So we are comforted by the fact that these countries have started to address this low-hanging fruit, but much more needs to be done. And if you look at countries like Thailand and Malaysia, they've done a good job in terms of their manufacturing base, but they are increasingly competing with China, right, in some areas of, let's say, electronics production. And you need to see further improvements in education in particular in order for them to move up the value-added scale and compete in higher value-added areas of manufacturing. The last thing I'll mention, on the ASEAN level, the reason why it matters so much is that you can say there's a bit of global competition for FDI as well. As much as regional integration is a great story in Asia, you see actually the Indian government, for example, being a bit more serious about reforms recently, wanting to attract more manufacturing to India. And to some extent, that does compete with ASEAN. So, Vietnam is a great destination, but it's still a market of 100 or so million people. While if you have an effective single production base and consumer base across ASEAN with less barriers for consumers, it actually opens up to a much larger domestic market. So the economies of scale argument is there. And for that, we need to see real tangible progress on the areas of the ASEAN integration, ASEAN economic community, especially the non-tariff barriers.
Thanks, Joseph. I'll ask Tommy and Adam to answer the follow-up from what Joseph just says. How do you drive ASEAN forward when you do have 10 countries who are effectively competing with each other and economic integration is moving extremely slowly? And there's actually a question on the Q&A from Raymond Yee at DHL, who's essentially saying ASEAN's great at issuing blueprints and framework agreements and toolkits and everything else, but then the delivery lacks. So how can we help them drive forward?
I think that the question is not fair. It is true that there is often a gap between ASEAN proclamations, aspirational statements, and reality on the ground. But on ASEAN economic integration, I think all 10 governments are committed to this goal. What I want to say is that the governments and officials should acknowledge that the job is not done. We seem to say, well, we've done it, but the reality on the ground is that the job is not done. It's a work in progress. We need to work harder to erase these invisible and non-tariff barriers, blocking the full integration of the 10 ASEAN economies. So I want to say this for the benefit of my friend Yanti from Brunei, that this ought to be on the ASEAN agenda for 2021. ASEAN economic integration is still a work in progress. It is not completed.
That's very true. It's got a long way to go. Adam, anything you want to add on this particular set of questions?
Just very briefly, and sort of the easy answer that Joseph mentioned was, it's all of the above. I mean, at the end of the day, for what matters to a business is what the country does. The policies in a country or a state or a province. At the end of the day, business gets done at the project level, and projects happen in countries, and so. That's if that's not happening, then it doesn't really matter what agreements are happening globally or regionally. Having said that, our sense is that the flurry of, I think there was a degree of frustration with the ASEAN Economic Community approach on its own. And then we've seen sort of subsets of ASEAN engage in different trade arrangements. So the TPP was the first one with 4 ASEAN members in it, which was very, very demanding, sort of, the so-called 21st century trade deal. RCEP, of course, all 10 ASEAN countries are in, but a number of ASEAN members have gone off and gotten engaged in quite impressive bilateral FTAs, and those have sort of it's partly symbolic, but it really provides some discipline on what happens at the domestic level, and it's the combination of those two things, like where you have those regional global commitments providing discipline on local policymakers. That what we've seen in the last couple of years seems to be providing more discipline, and that's a good thing, than what we saw from the AEC on its own. It seemed like the AEC wasn't quite enough, so to speak, discipline, but the combination of the AEC, which is the framework for ASEAN economic integration, together with these other sets of disciplining forces, it does. And of course we have to bring the COVID situation back in, just because there's a much stronger need for additional capital and access to export markets. All of those things put together, we're starting to see some real reforms in a number of countries, even in, as Joseph was mentioning, kind of the 2 big countries, Indonesia and Philippines, who have been a bit slow to come to this party, have now arrived.
Okay, thank you, Adam. There's a few questions on the Q&A which relates to trade deals, and particularly to RCEP. Perhaps I can ask all 4 of you if your view on RCEP. I mean, to my mind, RCEP's a great deal, but it's probably more important politically than in terms of the depth and breadth of the trade deal itself. When do you think we can see it ratified and actually be coming into force? And a side question for Yanti. Sorry about this, Yanti, but you are on LegCo. When is Brunei going to ratify the cptpp?
Okay, right. I think this is really interesting when it comes to ratification, because it will actually take time for all the 10 countries plus 5 to actually ratify the whole thing, because it will basically needs to be again tested. So from Brunei side, I can't actually say when it's going to be as well. So I guess every single ASEAN countries will actually have to go through that. But that's the reason why the sooner AMS basically ratify this, the better. Then we actually will be able to see the development of RCEP, because it is a very early stage to actually look into it. And I'm sure this was actually also discussed under the cooperation of committee of a whole, and they actually touch with regards to with the RCEP as well. So really, I do hope that it can actually be ratified as soon as possible, Chris.
Thanks, Yanti.
I'm surprised they have not.
I'll be brief, but I think, your general assessment, I would generally agree with that. And most of the academic studies about RCEP do indeed suggest that actually most of the trade gains to 2030 will actually be accrued in North Asia, right? Because it's the first time that China, South Korea, and Japan are linked in a free trade agreement. So it's still important for ASEAN, but for example, if you were to take, I think, a lot of the specific FTAs that ASEAN's already in with the RCEP partners, many of them already actually have currently a larger level of tariff-free good exchange than RCEP would achieve at the beginning. So in a sense, and usually under trade agreements, you have to trade under one specific agreement, one specific set of benefits. So it might not be a big benefit in the short term, but it's still important over the longer term. It signals that the region is continuing to pursue integration. And I think in terms of the rules of origin, the fact that it unifies the varying sets across the different trade deals, and many people suggest, including us, that the rules of origin is one of the most advantageous parts of RCEP because of how broad it is. It's just 40% basically minimum for RCEP wide content. So that's good for ASEAN as a production base, and I think further extensions this FDI trend I was talking about before.
Thanks, Joseph. Tommy, Adam, anything you want to add on RCEP and its importance for the region?
No, first I want to say about cptpp. I'm surprised that Brunei has not ratified it yet. because it's already come into force, you know. So cptpp has come into force. To me, the really interesting question is, will Biden reconsider joining cptpp? And if so, in the early part of his administration or later part, because I know that there's a political cost, but it is a strategic blunder on the part of President Trump to withdraw from cptpp. In its original form, TPP, it was a signature achievement of the Obama administration. And I would argue in the case of cptpp that the United States cannot afford to stay out forever in this important economic architecture. As for RCEP, actually ASEAN has FTAs with all the dialogue partners. The merit of RCEP is that it seeks to harmonize all this bilateral agreement in a multilateral agreement. You know, and I think it's important.
Okay, I agree with you. Adam, do you have a view?
No, listen, I don't have much more to add on RCEP that's been said. I'll take a segue off of Tommy's comment about Biden and CPTPP. I couldn't agree more that it was an enormous strategic blunder to pull out of the TPP in early 2017, and again to sort of connect those two conversations. I think one of the important things about some of the bilateral FTAs that individual ASEAN countries have gotten into, the CPTPP and RCEP, shows that, was a very good counter argument to the Trump administration's argument, which was, seen by many as kind of the U.S. retreating from free trade and multilateral trade, and then sort of the rest of the world putting its chips in through, part of these FTAs. Was a very useful tonic in response to that. I'm not optimistic that Biden or the U.S. will prioritize rejoining CPTPP, which is unfortunate in many respects. I mean, a lot of the language in that document is, was U.S. written language. Whether it was on government procurement or role of state enterprises or data localization and a whole bunch of other topics as well, as seen by the fact that a lot of that very language was sort of cut and pasted from to go into the new NAFTA and into the sort of the small deal with Japan, et cetera. Unfortunately, the politics in the U.S. are just not very supportive, I think, of entering a new mega trade deal. So the U.S. is going to have to figure out, what is going to be a compelling economic element of its Indo-Pacific strategy. So far, in my view, it's got some ideas, but it doesn't really meet on them just yet. And that's a big challenge for the Biden administration. But, while we're talking about the U.S., I mean, I would make a more positive argument is that we talked earlier, I mentioned earlier, I know my fellow panelists agree with me, but I'm of the view that sort of the U.S.-China tensions have actually been, ASEAN has been more of a beneficiary than a loser, although there's been some anxious moments for sure. I think we're with the Biden administration coming into power, there's not really going to be a lot of decrease in U.S.-China.
I think we lost Adam again temporarily. I guess he was going to say there's not going to be much change in the US-China impact.
Yeah. I think rhetorically it's going to be quite different, actually. I think in terms of the policies, particularly in the technology arena, those are going to stay. But I think there's more understanding. There's a good Asia team, and there's a good foreign policy team generally in the Biden administration. They recognize that they have to play several games at the same time, and so that lends itself to kind of going back to a more it's not going to go back to where it was pre-Trump, but I think we'll see. The pressures to diversify their investment portfolio around the region are going to remain. And that actually means ASEAN should benefit from that. And actually there should be less anxiety because they have to be less worried about, the scary tweet at 4 o'clock in the morning. So on that front, I think ASEAN it's a net positive for ASEAN.
Okay, thank you. That takes me nicely on to some points actually that Tommy was making during his introduction. And I wrote down the word strategic balance on my piece of paper here. So that the need for ASEAN to maintain some sort of strategic balance between other powers, and hopefully for the other powers in the world to step up to the plate more with ASEAN. There's actually a question on the Q&A, which is geopolitically, how can ASEAN remain neutral but useful at the same time? Which is a great question. So, Professor Carr, I'm coming to you with that one.
Actually, there's no contradiction between being neutral and being useful. My argument is that if ASEAN is not neutral, it is not useful to anybody. If ASEAN becomes partisan, either aligning itself with China or with the United States, we're not useful to the great powers. In this region, it is a very unique situation in the world. In most other regions, the conveners are the great powers. But in Southeast Asia, it is these 10 relatively small countries, ASEAN, that acts as a convener, as a facilitator, as a neutral chairman. The moment we become partisan or divided, we are of no use to anybody.
That's a great answer. Yanti, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to actually say something too. I mean, ASEAN must stick together because that is basically our strength. Yes, we are basically, Brunei is only like 400,000+ population, Chris. So basically, if we actually stand together as ASEAN, we are basically stronger. But I think it's really looking at how we need to actually seize opportunity quite fast, in a fast track, because we know that it is competitive out there. It needs to be resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. So we have to stick as ASEAN. Otherwise, then because one thing unique about this, our community. Again, we have our own culture. We have that one voice. We're always very proud of this ASEAN. And I think this is why we actually need to stick together. And that's the reason why ASEAN is strong. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll move the conversation because time is marching on. I want to talk a bit more about EU-ASEAN relations. It's been brought up by several of you that the move to strategic partnership. Yanti was very generous in her praise about the support the Business Council provides to the region, which embarrassed me slightly. But nevertheless, what do the four of you think? I would like all four of you to address it. What do you think will be the tangible and measurable benefits of ASEAN for the upgrading of that relationship? Will things like the EU Green Deal help? I mean, Brunei has energy transition and circular economy as PEDs for this year. How much help can Europe bring to the table on this? What more do you want Europe to be doing to help ASEAN with economic recovery and making sure we end 2021 on a high? Who would like to go first, please? Tommy?
Okay, let me begin. I want to say, Chris, that on the European side, there is a huge gap between the business people on the ground in Southeast Asia and the policymakers, the politicians in the respective capitals in Europe and in the European Parliament. Somehow we don't occupy much mind share in Europe. I think you yourself pointed out one of the previous webinars that when the European Trade Commissioner delivered his first statement to the European Parliament, he didn't say a word about ASEAN. To him, ASEAN is irrelevant. He doesn't know that this region offers Europe more economic opportunities than any other region in the world. There's also a problem on the ASEAN side. On the ASEAN side, we suffer from ignorance. Very few ASEAN citizens understand that EU is the biggest investor in ASEAN. It's not America, it's not Japan, it's not China. It is the European Union. ASEAN citizens are also not aware of the many other things that the European Union is doing in ASEAN to help us in our integration effort, in in the provisional ODA, environment, so on and so on, you know. EU is doing so many good things in the region and the people don't know it. And even ASEAN officials don't know it. So I want to bridge this gap of ignorance.
Join the club. I'm trying to do the same. Joseph, as you work for Europe's largest bank, not just the UK's largest bank, but Europe's largest bank, what's your view about how that relationship can be strengthened to benefit the citizens of ASEAN, if anything else?
I just think there's some very tangible areas that you can have an increase in cooperation. So climate change definitely comes to mind. I think one of the interesting things about the COVID-19 crisis is that it's allowed a lot of ASEAN countries actually rethink their energy plans, for example. So, you know, if you look going into 2020, among the majority of kind of increase in coal-fired power plants in the world, many of these were in ASEAN, actually, in Indonesia and Vietnam and Philippines. And fortunately, given the collapse in energy demand, a lot of policymakers have started to rethink these energy, these projects. And actually, it's quite interesting with the technological advances that's been happening. I mean, in many parts of Asia now, actually solar-derived electricity is actually cheaper than coal. So, you know, 5 years ago, coal was significantly cheaper, but the economics are changing by the day. So a lot of, you know, regional policymakers are already realizing that they're willing to change things, but there's still need for a little bit more, maybe technological assistance, global policy support, financing support. If you look back at the Paris climate deal pledges, a lot of the pledges that ASEAN member states made were contingent on multilateral financing support from institutions. It doesn't seem that all of that support has actually come through. So I think if Europe, together with the US, start to take the initiative again on climate change, make this a global issue, hopefully you can see tangible progress. Because, you know, if you look at the top 10 cities globally, or 20 cities globally that are most vulnerable to climate change in the short term, specifically by rising sea levels, I think in the top 10 ASEAN nations are in the top 5, ASEAN cities are in the top 5 or something like that. You know, if you look at the headlines from Jakarta, a large chunk of southern Vietnam, all the estuaries around ASEAN, right? And the majority of the cities in the region are built on river deltas, right? And that's the areas that are most susceptible to flooding. So it's a very, very real risk in the short term. And this is an area where Europe can provide a lot of support.
Thanks,
if I could just add, you know, not to end on a pessimistic note, but I am a little concerned about, you know, I mean, climate, you know, with the Green New Deal in Europe, with Biden coming in the U.S. and John Kerry as a climate czar, and, you know, and Xi Jinping in China and it's sort of, you know, net carbon neutral by 2060. All of a sudden, climate change and sustainability has come to the front burner very, very quickly, and that's all for the good. Nothing wrong with that. I think it's going to take some good diplomacy on both sides, on ASEAN and the EU, to figure out what is an achievable and acceptable timetable to comply with this. You know, we've seen, for example, on the palm oil dispute between ASEAN and the EU, that was not handled particularly well on either side, in my view. But it's an example of what can go wrong when an economic issue becomes ideological, and there's going to be a bunch of those coming up. And I just think I look at that as, you know, and I'm not too worried about it in a 10-year time frame. I'm a little worried about it in a 2 to 4 year time frame, because some of these issues can get politicized quite quickly.
And Yanti, what are you hoping for in terms of support from the EU to help you achieve those PEDs there in Brunei?
I do agree with Tomia. I think the fact that providing awareness of what, you know, EU has entered ASEAN for, the investment is actually huge from EU side in ASEAN country, and I guess the awareness is actually not really there much. So I do hope that we can actually fill up this gap and make sure that things can actually be done in that particular level. So we hope that there's more collaboration and participation with the EU from the business side. Chris.
More than happy to provide that from our point of view. Okay, I'm going to do a quick fire round with a couple of questions. So I think yes or no answers wherever you can, or perhaps a single word answer. One question, which I think is an excellent one. Do you think the closure of academic institutions from the end of the first quarter of last year and a move then to online teaching will have an impact on ASEAN countries' long-term productivity and competitiveness? So Let's start with you, Yanti, I think, for this one, given that you have fire coming up.
Yes. Just one word, Chris. Yes.
Okay. Tommy.
I think it's a no, because when you move things online, it benefits countries which are technologically advanced, and it disadvantages countries which are not technologically advanced. So it's going to increase the gap within ASEAN, between the more advanced country and the less advanced.
Yeah, and that is a concern. Adam, you have a view?
Fully agree with Tommy there. I think the risk there is a gap in inequality. I think you can use a simple metric by the degree of internet penetration per country, and the higher it is, the more the answer is no to that question, and the lower it is, the more the answer is yes to that question.
And Joseph.
Yeah, I would agree. There is a big impact, especially in the nations that are archipelagos with large, rural sectors. Big impact on education achievements.
Okay. Your next quick fire question. Will we be traveling before the end of this year again, or are we facing another year of our passports gathering dust?
Singapore desperately. The first one we negotiated was with Hong Kong, and it had to be postponed because suddenly there's a surge. We have unilaterally opened up Singapore to travelers from a certain number of countries, such as Australia, New Zealand, I think Vietnam, and some Chinese cities. But we are not getting so many travelers, So I think first half of this year, there will not be much traveling. I'm hoping that in the second half of this year, when people have been vaccinated, when more and more countries achieve herd immunity, travel will begin to resume.
Okay.
I agree with Tommy as well. But, Chris, I don't even know where my passport is now. Seriously.
I had the same problem. Although I am planning to go to Brunei in March, so one of the few places we can get to. Okay. I have a more serious question. You all mentioned about recovery, and I think you all touched upon the fact that vaccines are going to be a key part of that, or getting herd immunity. How can we avoid vaccine nationalism within ASEAN and ensure that everyone's going to get an equal chance of getting a vaccine across the region? I think this is a key question. We're already seeing tensions elsewhere in the world overnight between the UK and Europe. Yeah. So how can we make sure that everyone can get the vaccine and people don't start hoarding it within ASEAN?
It's a good question, Chris. I want to speak to my own compatriots. So I want to make the point to fellow Singaporeans that it is in Singapore's national interest to help other ASEAN countries gain vaccines so that they can inoculate their people. The bottom line is Singaporeans are not safe if the Indonesians are not safe. So it is in Singapore's national interest to make the acquisition of vaccine an ASEAN project and not just a national project.
Anybody else want to take this one?
My view of it, as we sort of are tracking this at the country level, is that most countries have been pretty active in trying to line up procurement deals for vaccines. The Philippines, as one example, has 25 open negotiations right now with 25 different vaccine makers. So there's a lot of activity. We'll see the delivery times, if they actually happen when they're supposed to deliver. Most ASEAN countries are in reasonable shape in terms of the deals that they've made. To Joseph's point at the top of the hour, we're not looking at herd immunity in 2021 in probably any country other than Singapore. That could happen a little bit sooner in some. There's going to be a joint Indonesian-Chinese manufacturing operation in Indonesia. The Thais have done something similar with AstraZeneca. So by the middle of the year, as those things begin to crank up, there's some possibility there for the supply to jump up. So far, ASEAN has been ASEAN as a group has been largely absent from this conversation. It's been a country by country led process. I agree with Tommy. There's certainly a role for ASEAN there, but at the end of the day, ASEAN doesn't have the budget to buy the vaccine, and that still has to be at the country level. So again, the big, most of the large markets are in pretty good shape. China and India are both picking up, either donating or giving low cost vaccines to Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos. So it's obviously not great, but it's not we wouldn't call it dire right now. It's just something to be watched.
Thank you. Yanti, and actually I'm back in your pathway document last year, you were actually calling for ASEAN to work together on purchasing the vaccine and distribution. That hasn't happened. Any thoughts as to why?
Well, healthcare, Tan Sri Munir is very passionate about this, really. And it actually has been highlighted several times, including to the leaders as well. So we'll actually see how it actually goes this year as well, because I know that we will have to actually keep on pushing this issue with regards to this vaccination. So every single country is actually now desperately requires this vaccination. And as what Tommy actually said, so we actually have to also be mindful with regards to other ASEAN countries as well, who is not able to actually have the capital access in terms of this vaccination. So we do hope that this can actually be highlighted. But I know that one thing for sure, for the Brunei government, they are very supportive of the idea.
Excellent, thank you. Right, I have a penultimate question which I'm going to direct Adam's way before I come to you all for a wrap-up statement. Adam, there's one question on the Q&A. What do you see as the opportunities and indeed the challenges for increased investment or trade for the CLM countries, for Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar?
I think I'd offer the same balance of the intrinsics are in okay shape. It's really going to be in those three countries in particular. I think there's greater COVID management concerns and vaccine procurement and distribution. The three of them are a little bit behind where the bigger ASEAN countries are in terms of securing and finalizing agreements to get vaccines. They're more reliant on donations on COVAX facility, and it's not clear the delivery time for vaccines coming through COVAX. So I think there's a little nervousness there. I think the general view is that the data about how much damage or what is the extent of the COVID damage both at health and an economic level. I think there's general sense that we don't understand that picture as well as we do with some of the bigger ASEAN countries. It's like we said, Myanmar did have elections. There's clearly less capital moving into Myanmar. That's been somewhat of an exception to the ASEAN story. Cambodia and Laos there's some issues. The Laos does not have large FDI to begin with, and Cambodia has been struggling with their duty free or their discounted duty relationship with the EU has been going back and forth over various human and political issues. And so I think there's and given the internet penetration point we were talking about earlier, I think there's a fair degree of concern about the growing inequality within ASEAN because of that set of issues. I don't think there's data to support that argument just yet, but I think it's a concern and again worth watching.
Okay, thank you. Right, we are at the end of our time. I'd like to thank all four of you very much. I have a final question for you all, and I'll give you 2 sentences each to answer it. Is that if we were to hold this panel again in 12 months' time and look back on 2021, would you think it was a fantastic year, a bad year, or a neutral year? And please give me your reasons why. And we'll start with Yanti, please.
I will have to be more optimistic. So it will actually be more hopeful year. And I think in anything that we actually see, we actually have to be very hopeful. I think what we actually need to do is, we talk about a lot of under ASEAN strategic plan and other things. But I think what we need to actually see, hoping as well this year is always about the execution. The execution and the implementation has always been probably low-hanging fruits. I think that should actually be pushed. Chris, so that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Yanti. Joseph, your view?
So I definitely share the broader optimism. I guess to take the counterpoint, I would argue that maybe we would say that 2021 compared to some expectations would be a disappointing year compared to maybe growth or the desire to travel. But I think that 2022 will be a very good year, actually. I think, like I said earlier in my remarks, that ASEAN is actually set up for a very good recovery. Once this really kind of difficult challenge of containing COVID is actually achieved, you have the recipes for a long run growth story, right? Driven by the FDI, driven by the investment, driven by the reform commitments that will only really be realized in terms of results probably in 2022, 2023. So short-term challenges, but even more optimistic on the long run, the relative long run position of ASEAN.
Thank you. And Adam?
Yeah, I'm pretty much in that same boat. I think your passport's still going to be dusty. I think the travel is going to pick up slower than a lot of people think it will, both from a supply and a demand point of view. I mean, even just because travel is allowed again, it's not clear that people are going to want to travel just yet. So I think that's going to be a little slow. I think, to Joseph's point, there was some expectations set for 2021, like in July, August, September 2020, when there's huge rebound prediction for 21 GDP. And I think those now, because it's taken longer, we've had second wave, third wave of COVID, the 2020 numbers are going to be worse than we thought, and 2021 numbers are therefore going to be a little slower to recover than we thought. But all that said, apart from the caveat that we've been talking about is that COVID gets worse, or there's a new variant, or vaccine stop, or the economic intrinsics are actually in ASEAN's favor, and those caveats with COVID, largely COVID-related caveats aside, our view is that ASEAN will look better, and probably significantly better in places 12 months from now than it does today.
Excellent. And finally, Tommy, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, you said 2 sentences, right? So here are my 2 sentences. My first sentence: in a year from now, ASEAN would have recovered both from the pandemic and the second sentence is to becoming one of the world's most competitive regional economies. Those are like 2 sentences.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I am now changing my mind from being a pessimist to an optimist for this year on the back of this conversation with the 4 of you. Thank you, Yanti. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Prof. Ko. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Please look out for more webinars coming up from the Business Council. And everyone keep safe and keep well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Chris.
inviting us. All the best.
Bye.